We discussed the persona pattern and how we can use it to give the large language model all of this rich information about what it's supposed to do and what it's supposed to output with a very little bit of work on our part. All we have to say is act as, and it will know what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to format it and the types of things that it's supposed to incorporate into its output. Now, sometimes what we'd also like to do is we'd like to do the same thing, but rather than focusing on who the large language model is supposed to act like, we want to have the large language model produce an output for a particular persona. So this is called the audience persona pattern. The idea behind this is we want to tell the large language model, you need to produce an output for this audience persona, for this person or thing, so that it can think about how to tailor the output. And it will use its knowledge of the audience to make sure that it generates an output that is appropriate for that audience. So rather than saying you don't do this or having a whole bunch of different rules describing what is and is not okay to go into the output, instead we say this is the audience of your output. This is the audience persona. And so with the audience persona pattern, we can get a similar type of reasoning and ability out of that we got from the act as this persona, using the persona pattern. We can get that by saying, here's who you're providing the output to. This is the persona of the audience in order to get interesting outputs. So let me show you an example of this. So we're going to start with the example of large language models, which we've been studying in this course. And we're going to say, explain large language models and how they work to me. Assume that I have no background in computer science. So we're giving it a persona of who I am. We're saying, assume that I have no background in computer science, and that's telling it who is the persona, who is the audience that I'm giving this information to. And so it says, sure, let's start with the basics. And I want to call out just a couple of things. It starts with a very sort of intuitive way of describing this. A large language model is a type of computer program that's designed to understand and generate human language. It's a bit like a virtual writer that can understand and create sentences in a way that sounds natural to humans. And so it's not describing it like it would to a computer scientist. It's describing it to be, something that is accessible and approachable to anyone. Language models are used in many applications such as speech recognition, machine translation, and chatbots. Now let's talk about large language models. The word large refers to the size of the language model, and it goes on to describe it, and it says parameters are like adjustable knobs that the model uses to learn patterns in the language. So it's describing what a parameter is in a sort of accessible way. And it goes on and it talks about all the different steps in creating this. So it did a good job, right? I said, assume that I'm not, I don't have background in computer science, and explain it to me. And so it made sure in its explanation that it had the right information and then presented it at the right level for me. So let's go a step further. Let's show you how interesting this can get. I'm going to say, explain large language models and how they work to me. Assume that I am Christopher Columbus. So notice, now I'm giving it something completely different. I don't know how you would explain large language models to Christopher Columbus. So it's going to have to use and draw on information in its training data and patterns related to Christopher Columbus and history to try to figure this out, right? I'm giving it an audience persona that's a tricky one that I wouldn't know how to do easily. And it says, greetings, Christopher Columbus. As an explorer of 15th and 16th centuries, you may not be familiar with the concepts of computer science and artificial intelligence, and I don't know how well this really works, but it's still pretty good that it's doing it. I'll do my best to explain it. Imagine that you have a magical scribe, a being that can read, write, and understand many languages. This scribe has spent years reading countless books, scrolls, and manuscripts from all over the world. It has learned from poets, scholars, and storytellers. The magical scribe has a special ability. It can predict what comes next in a sentence. For example, if you say to the scribe, the ocean is vast, it might respond with mysterious, completing your sentence in a way that makes sense. And so you can see how all we did is we said, you're going to explain the exact same thing, But you're going to assume in the first case that I don't have knowledge of computer science. And then we said, now you're going to assume that I'm Christopher Columbus, right? And so it completely changes how it describes large language models. And it's actually doing a pretty good job. So it's saying here, like Christopher Columbus doesn't know what a computer is. You know, Christopher Columbus, but maybe this concept of a magical scribe, right? And a magical scribe could be a concept that could make sense to Christopher Columbus. And then he's explaining how large language models predict the next word. He's saying the magical scribe studied all of these, you know, all of these scrolls and poems and different things and learned to figure out what is the next word in a sentence. And now we're going to use that magical scribe, and we're going to talk to the magical scribe. So he's, you know, he's explaining, you know, the scribe like Christopher Columbus, you know, as he's going to understand it, as Christopher Columbus will be able to look at the text and kind of understand that, like, okay, you know, I have this large language model, and now I've got this magical scribe. It kind of makes sense on what that means and like how that would possibly work. So now let's look at a third example. We say, explain large language models and how they work to me. Assume that I'm a second grader that gets bored easily. And so again, we're giving it a totally new persona, and we're also refining this persona. We're saying I'm a second grader, and here's some additional details about, you know, me. I get bored easily. And so now it goes and says, okay, I'm going to tell you something super cool called a large language model. Imagine having a robot friend who's really good at playing word games. This robot can finish your sentences, answer questions, and even tell you stories. Here's how it works. Reading time. The robot friend loves to read. It reads lots and lots of books, websites, and all kinds of things with words. And so it's explaining this concept of, you know, similar to as it explained to Christopher Columbus, you know, it told Christopher Columbus, you know, the large language model is like a scribe that's read all of these scrolls and poems and things like that. And now the large language model is explaining to the second grader, you know, it's like a robot. And the robot loves to read. It reads books, websites, and words. And so now it's switched up the description based on the persona of the audience. And then it goes on to describe all of the different aspects again. And you could go through and ask it, you know, to describe it in many different ways. So if we wanted to go back and we wanted to say, well, let's switch it up from a second grader, and let's say, assume that I only accept explanations in math. And then we could say something completely different. So now it's saying, okay, language model is a probability distribution, and it's trying to give a mathematical explanation of what a large language model is. And we can see that we're getting something completely different. And each time, we don't have to necessarily think through, well, you know, how would I explain this to Christopher Columbus? What would the rules be to describe how that output should look? We don't have to tell it what the output should look like. We tell it who the audience is, the persona of the audience, and then we get all of that rich capability around it. So just like the persona pattern is really useful in tapping into large language model capabilities, the audience persona pattern is sort of the complement to it and is also sort of an equally powerful thing that we can use to basically get really interesting and powerful output out of large language models.